Hey guys, and welcome to Scientific Drinking, episode 23. My name is Mas, and consider the following three claims. First is that console sales, video game consoles, have been plummeting. They're not going to be any use to anyone in the next few years. Or I could say that the console sales have been skyrocketing, having a prosperous future ahead of them. Or I can make the claim that console sales are stagnant, unchanging. Which one is true? Well, depending on your perspective, maybe all of them. On this episode, we're taking a look at misinformation, manipulated data, and fake news. Cheers. All right, so they say you need to practice something about 22 times before you really get a hang of it. So this is episode 23, so it should be pretty good, right? Tonight I'm drinking a bourbon barrel aged porter, and it's delicious. 10.5% ABV. I think it's called Registered Complaint by Dirty Whore Brewing. I'm not complaining. All right, so fake news. That's a pretty big domain, so let's narrow it down to 6 different topics. These are all pretty digestible and represent a sliding scale of fake news. The first category is satire. Think John Oliver's Last Week Tonight or The Daily Show. These shows kind of spin the news for comedic value. They're just trying to get a laugh out of you. They're not considered fake in the way that they're conveying false information. In fact, all the information from them has been pretty thoroughly background checked and analyzed. And each of those hosts are coming from a certain perspective. So there's a little bit of bias in there, and that bias is pretty much just to make you laugh, right? So this is the lightest category of so-called fake news. The second category is parody, something like The Onion or The Babylon Bee. These are definitely fake articles, but they're advertised as being fake. All of these sites tell you that they're parody sites, and in their descriptions tell you that you shouldn't really be taking any of those seriously. And if you are, well, I'm sorry. Now, the third category is state propaganda. And, when I say that, most people think of China, USSR, North Korea, maybe Vietnam. Authoritarian states that are generally communist or one-party states that kind of push their own agenda into the entire people. This is less of a problem in multi-party states that we see a lot in the West, but it still exists.
To understand communism, its basic godless philosophy, its goal of world conquest, its insidious tactics, and its cunning strategy.
And don't underestimate the degree to which patriotism and nationalism can wind its way into state propaganda and find its way onto your newsfeed. And the fourth category is advertising and PR. And this is where you can get into some really misleading stuff. Of course, I guess you can get into some pretty misleading stuff with state propaganda as well, especially if it's coming out of North Korea. We've all been exposed to advertisements on TV or billboards, but this is different. What I'm talking about here are the articles that find themselves onto your Facebook feed or social media feed that pose as genuine news articles, maybe a scientific publication or something to that effect. It presents itself as being a legitimate news source when really it's just trying to sell you a product. If you're seeing a Prozac advertisement that claims to be doctors find new method of treating, what does Prozac deal with? Depression? Doctors find a new way of treating depression with Prozac, and it's at Prozac.org or Prozac.com, well, chances are it's not really fact-based, it's just there to sell you something. The fifth category is manipulations. This is becoming more and more of a problem, especially with how easy it is to use Photoshop these days. I mean, I taught myself how to use Photoshop, well, that and a bunch of YouTube videos. Thanks, YouTube. In addition to that, of course, CGI, computer-generated imaging, software is becoming more and more ubiquitous, appearing everywhere, and you can make yourself look like a world leader.
It's gonna be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of up dystopia.
And the sixth category is genuine fake news, and it's not as prolific as you might think. So a lot of people think that fake news is kind of a more recent development, something that came along as the price of having internet. But really, it's the price of having free speech or a free society. The earliest recorded examples of fake news was as far back as 1640, but there are plenty of examples since then. One such example is from John Adams, who said, "There has been more new error propagated by the press in the last 10 years than in the 100 years before 1798. Wow, that's saying quite a lot. And I'm sure many people feel that way today. Likewise, another quote by Attorney General Dudley Ryder in response to reports of King George II's death in the mid-1700s said, "As the publication of such false news of His Majesty has a tendency to disquiet the minds of his subjects, hurt public credit, and diminish the regard and duty which they owe him." Sound familiar? Maybe not. It's using kind of older Victorian-era speech, but it pretty much means that, yeah, it kind of is a damage to national security if there's too much fake news. That was true then, and it's true now, as we have known that there's been some foreign entities that have been meddling with our news and maybe propagating a little bit more fake news than we otherwise would generate ourselves. Another example is Mark Twain's news of my death has been greatly exaggerated in 1897, followed by War of the Worlds, Jules Verne's very famous novel, which was read as a radio broadcast and inspired panic across the country because people thought it was real. That would definitely fall within the Babylon Bee parody category. Benjamin Franklin himself has been known to generate a little bit of fake news in his time. At the time, the Native Americans were mostly taking the side of the British and were fighting on their behalf in several different battles in areas in the Northeast. Benjamin Franklin made the claim that they were liberally scalping colonists at the time, which really just wasn't true, at least not on behalf of the British. I guess for him, the ends justified the means, even if it was a little bit racist in retrospect.
Stop! I protest these intolerable raps! It takes just one easy payment for me to whoop your ass!
Now, the peak of fake news, at least historically, was the age of yellow journalism in the Gilded Age between 1870 and 1900. And this is where fake news got so bad, people got pretty much fed up with it and had a kind of social revolution where they redesigned their entire news and reporting system. We'll get to that in a minute. Why is this important? Why are we talking about fake news? Well, obviously, they can have some pretty bad ramifications, and if the Attorney General and John Adams were to comment about it, certainly it became a big enough issue to warrant the attention of the upper echelon. Of course, fake news has been a cornerstone of the 2016 election, and it's easier for fake news to kind of proliferate around the internet. Social media, of course, has changed the game to a certain degree, and how we handle social media is a little bit of an open question. Some of the issues that have led up to this phenomena of fake news as we know it today include the vulnerability of news agencies. And that kind of may sound weird, right? We villainize mass media quite a lot these days. But the fact is that larger news agencies lost a lot of advertising revenue when the internet revolution came on. Now, initially, they could get away with just putting their news articles online and charging advertisers to advertise in certain spaces on their website. And that worked for a while, but advertisers discovered that, well, we have pop-up blocker, and most people just ignore those ads anyway. The efficacy of those ads falls off rapidly after they appear on the site. So the payoff for advertisers has been diminishing. That means that the news agencies had to drop their price or increase the number of ads or do something. So a lot of these news agencies have catered to a very specific audience. Generally speaking, the more partisan an organization is, the more susceptible they are to fake news. Now think about in the 1950s where you had local beats reporters who would patrol certain areas, gather information. They would be members of the community. They'd participate in local events and they get well known. But with the advent of news megacorporations and large-scale reporting in the internet, those local beats reporters had less and less of a job. That critical link between connecting the public with the news organizations they represent has fallen afoul and kind of disintegrated. On top of that, local news outlets have been absorbed by larger corporations such as ABC or Fox News, and the same rhetoric can be echoed throughout local agencies and local stations all across the country. It's very much dominated by this hierarchy from the top down. And that's a little bit of a separate topic in and of itself. On top of that, a lot of news stories that you might have read have been generated by AI, believe it or not, completely written and maybe fabricated by artificial intelligence. And that's bad news because artificial intelligences are very good at learning. They're capable of looking at the news articles that are shared the most, looking at the news articles that we like the most, and looking at the audience that the owners of this AI wish to target, and generate a news article that's specifically designed to be shared the most. That means that even less real people and real reporters are connected into the loop, and news articles can be generated at pretty much the snap of a finger. It's a little bit cheaper for larger news organizations to generate tremendous amounts of stories and hit on whatever sticks. The things that these AI generate aren't really fake news, at least not according to Allen et al. In 2020. Now in that paper, it was shown that of the 800 most populous news sites, only about 0.15% of that news is actually fake. Now that's using the definition of fake as being a completely fabricated or just misinformation in general. That doesn't include spin or bias, which is another kind of fake news. The perception of the general public is that up to 52% of news is fake, and that's an extreme amount, especially considering the estimate of 0.15%. So we perceive the news to be a lot more fake than it actually is, showing that we have completely lost trust in our media.
It used to be news, now it's opinions.
Of the fake news sites, or the extremely partisan sites, there's about 1% of people that really soak this stuff up. And I'm sure all of us have at least one or two Facebook friends that really represent that 1% strong. So why are we talking about all these examples? Well, the point is that fake news can damage your credibility, it damages the trust between people and the news agencies that they rely on to get their information, and it can be a damage to national security. All right, so that's all well and good. We know it's out there, but how do we identify fake news? Well, there's a lot of little fallacies and tricks that you can be aware of to help you identify what's fake news and what's not. First example is if the article isn't really from an established source. Now, we talked about 800 news organizations that are the most common, most prolific, but that's a lot to remember. Generally speaking, if the news organization isn't an actual news outlet, well, it's probably fake, or maybe it's advertising like we talked about earlier. 2 is it begins with an opinionated statement. Something like, as though President blah 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 hasn't done enough damage to the economy already, and then continues. Well, it's already priming you to feel a certain way about the information you're about to read. So you're going to walk away from that with a bias, and maybe not with the objective sense that you really need when absorbing new information. That drives the partisan gap and makes us more and more divided. Another tip is maybe it doesn't quantify its claims. And what I mean by that is if it doesn't give any numbers. What percentage of people? How many cars? How often does this happen? If it doesn't quantify the claims, give numbers, then maybe they're just making things up. And that leads up into the next point. When they do quantify them, do they cite their sources? Larger organizations, including Fox News and CNN, are very good at citing their sources. Another example is something that steers you to a certain opinion. John Oliver has been known to do this, and it's been quantified. The John Oliver effect is very real, and it shows that he can really get some response out of the people that watch his shows. He's steering them to do something, even if it's not directly intentional, and he's just presenting his own viewpoint or the viewpoint of his team. Not saying John Oliver's unreliable or misleading, just saying think for yourself. Another warning sign is if authors have no expertise in their field. If someone's making broad and damning claims about the coronavirus or anything else, think to yourself, is this person an epidemiologist, a sociologist, an economist? Do they have some kind of credentials? Something that really justifies their opinion and the conclusions that they're drawing. Have they done their research? If they've done a little bit of research by Googling things and suddenly think they're an expert, well, maybe you should think back and consider whether you should trust this person. This is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, which means that people with very little knowledge tend to think very highly about their level of knowledge, not understanding or considering how much there is out there. When in doubt, consider the CRAAP test, C-R-A-A-P. Currency, relevance, accuracy, authority, and purpose, which kind of covers everything I just mentioned above. On top of that, there's a lot of fallacies that you should be aware of, something that happens with all of us. Everyone has been guilty of these fallacies at one time or another. No one is above them. Not me, not the president, not anyone. The first one is rosy retrospection, which is kind of like looking at the past through rose-colored glasses.
These rose-colored glasses.
Make America Great Again is a perfect example about this. Everyone thinks that things were better before, but were they? We tend to remember things that we like more than times we don't like. My personal experience in the military I remember fondly because of all the countries I visited, the great people I met, all the drinking I did. But in reality, time in the military kind of sucked. I had no say in what I was going to do or what I could do, and granted, I signed that away. I knew that was part of the deal. But I tend to remember it as one of the best times in my life, even though in reality, I didn't enjoy it that much. Rosy retrospection is something we always have to think about, remembering back in the good old days. Maybe they weren't all that good. Another fallacy is anecdotal evidence, and this is really common in some of the more partisan sites, where they consider one person's experience over the statistical average. One person's experience in a certain environment is not indicative or representative of the entire environment. If someone went to a theme park and had a terrible time, does that mean the theme park's bad? I don't know. Look at all the reviews. There's always one person that's been leaving a bad review, and that doesn't really give any evidence to the entire operation. Everyone's bound to have a bad experience with something at some time. That doesn't mean it's bad. Another example among partisan news sites is cherry picking. Cherry picking means selecting certain pieces of evidence that suit your preconceived worldview. In other words, if you want to prove that vaccines are bad, you can pick that one paper that says that there's a connection between vaccines and autism. Even though there are thousands of other publications that says that's just not the case, if you're just looking for that one piece of evidence, you can cherry pick the little pieces of evidence that suit your perspective. Doing good research means considering all evidence and weighing them based on the credibility of the data instead of how you perceive them to be emotionally and how they fit with your worldview. Part of science is changing your mind and admitting when you don't know something. Another one is kind of what I showed at the beginning of this episode: misrepresentation of data. You can show data in a certain way in order to justify your own opinions or beliefs. Now, remember the console sales example we looked at the beginning of the episode? Well, it turns out that you can represent that data 3 ways, and you can select which plot you want to show in order to justify your opinion. Take a look at this plot, which shows that console sales dropped from 45% of market share to 23% of the market share. But in reality, the only difference is that mobile games came into popularity and have been selling like crazy, diminishing both PC and console sales in terms of market share, but not in absolute terms. Likewise, I took a sample size of mass shootings in the US from 1980 to 2020. In this plot, I can show the entire timeline, and we can see exactly how many mass shootings there were, how many people died. If I select the data from 2000 to currently, I can claim that it's a recent phenomenon. It only started in 2000. Well, that's not true. It's been going on in the entire history of the United States. If I select 2016 and onward, I could claim that Trump has pretty much suppressed mass shootings and stopped them. Or if I select 2013 to 2016, I can claim that it declined under Obama. And now if I'm careful with both my Y and X axis, I can show that from 2010 to 2018, mass shootings have skyrocketed. But this is again misrepresenting the data. I can even overlay this black dotted line to help guide the viewer's opinion to thinking that mass shootings are absolutely skyrocketing. While it's true that mass shootings have been increasing in frequency and deadliness, it is nowhere near as bad as it's depicted in this graph. Now remember the 5G episode we talked about with coronavirus and conspiracy theories? This is another example of misrepresenting data by cherry picking. You're showing how many people were ever affected by the coronavirus, overlaying it with 5G network distribution, but correlation does not imply causation. This simply shows that population density affects both 5G network cell towers and the rate of spread of coronavirus. Part of this problem is the way people interpret scientists. And speaking from experience, it can be a little bit difficult to articulate the complexity of your work to someone who is not involved in it or has no experience in the field whatsoever. This is especially true in the medical field, which is especially dynamic and evolving and very complex. The human body is a real complex mechanism, so the people who deal with this on a daily basis have a lot of nuance to their work. Take this example from Dr. Gregory Poland of the Mayo Clinic.
Probably when are we going to be able to stop all the restrictions and precautions and then wait another 2 to 4 weeks before we can say, okay, probably all clear. I think every scientist and physician that has talked about this has said the same thing. We need to be logical, and then we need to watch, wait, be informed by the best data that we can get, which is just to measure if I get infected, how many people on average do I spread it to? We've learned that while children tend not to get severely ill or die from it, younger adults certainly do. We've also learned how this virus causes disease and in whom. In the older adults and people who have corresponding medical problems that increase their risk. A number of studies have been done. These show that you can detect the virus off of hard surfaces, public surfaces, for as long as 17 days. It really depends on the temperature, depends on the humidity, depends on exposure to UV light. It looks like plastic, stainless steel tend to be surfaces where it lasts longer.
Notice how he's saying why, probably, I think. Sounds like a lot of uncertainty. Does this guy even know his job? Yeah, he knows it pretty well. He got a PhD in the subject, and that takes a lot of work and a lot of dedication. People tend to dismiss scientists and their PhDs as just pieces of paper, but it's more than that. They spend a lot of time doing what they're doing. Remember the Dunning-Kruger effect: the more time you spend in something, the more careful you become. It's always nuanced. There's going to be a lot of detail that can't be simplified into certain concrete statements. So scientists tend to speculate and be careful with their words because they don't want to sound overconfident in the results.
You're stupid, stupid, stupid.
So oftentimes the public tends to interpret scientists being wishy-washy or uncertain or unreliable when in reality It's just really complex and it's hard to articulate that. And it takes a lot of time to study these topics to the degree that they deserve. All right, so that was a lot of information, but it really comes down to what can we really do about it? Aside from trusting scientists a little bit more, which is the preference, you definitely have to rebuild the trust in the news agencies. Now remember I mentioned before that the end of yellow journalism resulted in a radical shift in the way we deal with news. Well, that happened with establishing these local beats reporters and building this kind of chain between the consumer and the news agencies where everything was accountable and justifiable. I also mentioned that a lot of these companies need advertising revenue to function. They depend on that. And when they shifted to internet, they lost a lot of that revenue and compensated for it by targeting a very specific audience. Companies like the BBC don't rely so much on advertising revenue. In fact, I don't think they rely on advertising revenue at all. They're funded by the British government. That means they're instilled with a certain British bias, but again, everything is biased to a certain degree. One of the key takeaways is look from a third-party perspective if you're looking to gain an objective point of view, especially when it comes to politics. But when it comes to scientific information, you need to be a little bit more critical. Going directly to the source, such as scientific publications, can help, but also those tend to use a lot of jargon. And if you're not familiar with the field, it can be a little bit difficult to interpret. That being said, there are plenty of sources to go to that strive to be nonpartisan and unbiased. We can find alternate sources of funding for some of these news agencies so they don't have to cater to a more and more extreme side of politics in order to present their information. Now that's easier said than done, right? I mean, who wants to reach into their wallet every time they want to read a news article? Some of these news agencies depend on subscriptions in order for you to access the information, things like the New York Times. Remembering that the free news you're getting is free for a reason. And if you want to get that unbiased news, maybe you have to pay for it. Remember, we used to pay for newspapers, so what's the difference? And finally, educate, educate, educate. That's something I'm going to drive on a lot. I mean, educating people on what fake news is, what the danger is, and how to avoid it is really important. And being aware of all of these weak points that come with being human, the fallacies and biases that are always going to be there so long as we walk around in flesh and blood. Fake news is the cost of having a free society and having free speech, so we need to be aware that this is always going to be there. The trick isn't to eliminate it, but to educate people so that we don't really need it to justify our opinions. Dogma is the enemy of truth, and remaining objective is the most important part of finding a true and scientific conclusion. So thanks for watching this episode of Scientific Drinking. I know it was a long one, but I hope it contained a lot of good information and good perspectives. Cheers. Yeah, I told you I wasn't going to finish the whole thing. This is delicious.